Taste of Blackberries, Chapter 5. So, very sad. His best friend Jamie has died of a bee sting, which seems incredible to him, and definitely the narrator was in shock for a while and could not even imagine this had happened. I sat in the bathtub and poked ripples in the water. Soapy whiskers covered my chin. I hadn't eaten lunch before and now hadn't eaten supper. Dad and Mom were getting ready to go to the funeral parlor. That'd be like the funeral home where you sometimes go to a visitation and tell the family how sorry you are. They asked me if I wanted to go, but I couldn't do that to Jamie. It seemed that as long as I acted like he wasn't dead, he wouldn't be dead. The ring of ripples broadened, bounced off the sides of the tub, and larger still came toward me again. Someone said that ripples go on forever and ever, even when you can't see them anymore. I thought of me and Jamie throwing stones in a still pond, watching ripples. Jamie wouldn't make ripples anymore, or shampoo beards. I grabbed the soap and rubbed up a lather. The soap was my lamp, and I was Aladdin. I would rub life back for Jamie. Someone knocked on the door. We're going now, sweetheart. We won't be long. If you need anything, you go over to Mrs. Mullins. They were going. They were going to see Jamie. Suddenly, panicky, I yelled, Wait for me! I submerged and let the soap rinse off me. I rubbed my hair as dry as I could and I combed it. Mom straightened my part. Usually my hair just hung there, but when it was wet, it looked better combed. I had never been to a funeral parlor before. I had been to a funeral at a church when my dad's Uncle Jonah died, and he had tripped with his shotgun and blown off the top of his head, and at least that's what they said. The casket was open during the funeral, and row by row everyone went by to look. And as I went by the casket, I was prepared not to take a good look. But in just a glance, I saw Uncle Jonah's whole head, and then I looked. He was fixed up like nothing had happened. He didn't look like he'd been shot. He looked like he was going to wake up any minute and ask us what we were all doing, staring at him while he slept. Of course, nothing like that had happened to Jamie. He'd gotten stung by a couple of bees. It just didn't seem possible that a tiny thing like a bee could kill you. I guess a lot of bees were dead, too, if it was true they died when they stung you, and I wasn't glad that the bees were dead. I was sorry that anything was being dead, especially Jamie. When I had popped out of the bathtub, I said, wait for me. I hadn't known why, and now I did. I wasn't going to look at him, but if it was possible that Jamie knew what was going on, I wanted him to know that I was there, thinking about him. And there were people all around talking in whispers or not talking, and some were crying, and I leaned my back against the door frame, thinking to Jamie, I'm here, Jamie. He looks sweet, a woman said as she came out of the room, just like he's asleep, bless his heart. And I remembered how Uncle Jonah looked like he was sleeping, and I couldn't imagine Jamie looking like that, and I went in and pushed up between my mother and father. And there was Jamie. He was out straight with one hand crossed over his chest, and he didn't look like he was asleep to me. Jamie slept all bunched up. Jamie looked dead. We used to have these staring contests, Jamie and I. We would see who would blink first or laugh. And it began to sink in that Jamie wasn't going to open his eyes to stare back at me. He wasn't going to blink. He wasn't going to laugh. I ran out of the room and down the hall. The front yard of the funeral parlor was all green grass and colorful flowers with lights shining on them, and I snatched a yellow bloom from the stem and began tearing it to shreds. My father called to me, and I grabbed my shoulder, and he grabbed my shoulder and turned me around. Daddy. I buried my head into his chest until the buttons on his suit hurt my face. At home, I put on my pajamas, and Mother hung around telling me that sometimes we don't understand why certain things happen. And she waited for me to talk. And I just lay in bed with my hands behind my head. So this is him when his dad grabbed him. He just needed a hug. Finally, Mom touched my hair and kissed my cheek and left. I listened to her steps disappear, and then I got up and knelt by the front window. And there was my flashlight in its place on the windowsill. Jamie's was probably on his sill, too. I flicked on my light and shined it over toward Jamie's to see if I could see his flashlight, and of course I couldn't. The beam didn't carry that far, and when we signaled, we could never see each other, only the dots of light. Unless we put the lights up under our chins to make spooky faces. And there was a soft padding of footsteps in the hall, and I set my flash down and sprang into bed. They were coming to check. Every night, Mother or Dad, or sometimes both, would come check to see if I was asleep. So I pulled the sheet up, and I scurried around under it to find a comfortable position, and I let my head flop down, tilted a little sideways, and I raised my arm and tucked my hand by my cheek, and I took a deep breath, and I let out a big sleepy sigh, and I almost convinced myself that I was asleep. And the door made the slightest squeak as it opened. I imagined the crack of light slicing across the room, and I didn't hear a footstep, but something touched my forehead. I almost jumped. I concentrated on keeping my eyeballs from moving around behind my lids. Have you ever tried to fake that you're asleep? It's hard to do. It must have been my mother. The hand touching first my head, then my cheek, felt soft and smooth. She tucked the sheet up around my shoulders and under my chin, a habit she had even in the summer. She stopped tucking, and I heard the door close. And I opened my eyes. Everything was so black. I wondered if she was still in the room watching me. In a minute, my eyes were used to the dark, and I could see she wasn't. And I went back to the window. The front door sounded below me, and I didn't look down. I kept staring at Jamie's house, and I saw my mother going through Jamie's yard to the door. The sight of her turned on my tear faucet so suddenly that I was surprised. All day I hadn't cried, even when I pressed my face into my father's coat buttons. The strange thing is, I wasn't crying for Jamie. I was crying for me. And that is really true, right? When we lose someone that we love, of course we cry for them, but we miss them so much. It's very, very difficult for a long time, maybe forever sometimes. I wanted my mother to come back. I wanted her to take care of me. I wished I hadn't pretended to be asleep, and then she would have stayed to talk or just to sit quietly on the side of the bed, and I wished I was little and could sit on her lap and be rocked. The tears kept coming until I had them smeared all over my face. My face was tight where the tears had dried, and I was snuffling and fumbling around in the dark for a tissue. And the door opened again, and Dad's shadowy form filled most of the crack of light. And out of the habit, I dove for the bed. And he came over, and he picked me up as easily as if I was a baby. He sat me on his lap and cradled my head to his chest. Funny, I hadn't thought of Dad's lap, but it was just as good. I cried and cried and cried. So he hadn't cried at first. Sometimes things are just too awful. But he certainly is crying now, and he needs to. It's terribly sad. The next morning, some of the kids were playing, and I watched them out the window, and they were playing May I, but in hushed tones because of Jamie, and I wondered how they could play at all. The heaviness of Jamie's death was on me. My father had gone to work, but he was coming home in the afternoon to take us to the funeral. All of Jamie's friends would be there. A preacher or someone would say some things about Jamie, and then Jamie would be buried. I stood at the top of the stairway, and I listened for sounds of my mother. And I heard the buzz of the vacuum cleaner, and I tiptoed down the stairs, slipped through the kitchen, and went out. And I looked over at Mrs. Mullins' garden. Remember, in his backyard was Mrs. Mullins, and she had this beautiful secret garden. Front yard was Mrs. Hauser and Jamie, but the backyard was Mrs. Mullins. Right now, I wanted to be there more than anything. It was the most private place I knew, but Mrs. Mullins wasn't in the yard. When Mrs. Mullins is in the yard, sometimes we talk over the fence, and then she invites me into her garden and tells me all about growing things. But she wasn't there this morning, and I hated to bother her by ringing her doorbell. Timidly, I went to the side gate, lifted the latch, and went in. Once in, I wished I was out. I felt like a thief stealing into her garden. I walked quickly down the nearest path, paying no attention even when a butterfly brushed my cheek as it flitted by. At the end of the path, I looked back, and I was out of sight of Mrs. Mullins' windows. I sat down on a large stone, granite, Mrs. Mullins had said it was. At first glance, it looked gray, but if you looked closely, it was speckly black and white. Along one side, there were streaks of pink and green. The garden was radiant with summertime. My nose smelled the sweetness. I could almost hear the colors in my ears. Every color seemed to be there. I looked around to see if there really was. There were all shades of green, from a pale yellow green to nearly black. There were yellows from pale to golden orange, and oranges to rust browns, pinks to reds to purples. There were not many blues. My favorite of all was the bright blue raggedy cornflower. I felt sorry about the flower I tore up last night. It wasn't the flower's fault. I breathed deeply and heaved a sigh. Butterflies darted from flower to flower. And bees. I didn't mind about the bees. It wasn't their fault either. They didn't know Jamie was allergic. And there was a hummingbird hovering like a helicopter and then zooming away so fast that my eye could hardly follow. Only the sunflowers hung their heads as if they were sorry that Jamie was dead. But they weren't really sorry either, really. They didn't even know. They only hung their heads because the bloom was too heavy to stand up straight on the end of the stem. A different sound reached my ear, and I glanced sideways by my arm without moving my head, and Mrs. Mullins was moving slowly down the row of flowers. And I could only see the feet and the bottom part of the person, but I knew it was Mrs. Mullins. No one else wore such raggedy tennis shoes and baggy breeches. I hoped she wouldn't be mad that I was in her garden. "Hello," she said softly. And here he is in this beautiful garden, just having some time alone, right? Sometimes you just need time alone with your sadness. "Hello," she said softly. Mrs. Mullins always spoke softly. Sometimes it was hard to hear what she said. She sat herself down on a nearby stone, and all around her garden she had stones or concrete block or board benches, so I could sit and look from wherever I want, she had once told me. Her being there made me feel like I shouldn't have come, and I didn't know what to say to her, and the silence made me uncomfortable, and Mrs. Mullins was a great one for not talking sometimes. The air felt empty. I had to say something. "I hope you're not mad," I said. I didn't look at her. I stared at the ground between my feet. Mad? Why should I be mad? A question for a question. I didn't like for people to do that to me. Didn't she know why I thought she might be angry? "Because you didn't know I was here. I saw you come in." "You did?" I guess I expected she would have hollered out her window like Mrs. Hauser, "Get off my yard!" "I was in the kitchen. You came in right under my window." "You know about Jamie?" "Yes, I am so sorry about Jamie. And I'm sorry about you too, because you were his friend." Mrs. Mullins was as gentle as the butterflies. They were so fragile looking, yet they could fly, some of them, like the monarch, for thousands of miles. Mrs. Mullins had told me all about butterflies. Why did he have to die? The question lay there in the air between us, and the sound of it shocked me, but Mrs. Mullins didn't act surprised. "Honey, one of the hardest things we have to learn is that some questions do not have answers," I nodded. This made more sense than if she tried to tell me some junk about God needing angels. We just sat there for a few minutes, and this time the air didn't need to be filled, and I let my eyes wander around again to the grass, the flowers, the birds. Everything was alive. I was alive. Mrs. Mullins was alive. What's it like to be dead, or is that another one of those questions? "It's one of those questions," she said. "You just don't know until you can find out yourself, and apparently you can't come back and tell what you found out." "Jamie was special," I said. "I know." Mrs. Mullins stood up and walked away. I didn't know if she was somewhere in the garden or if she'd gone back into the house, and I knew she meant for me to stay as long as I wanted, and I stayed until my mother called me for lunch. My sister was there from camp. She was a counselor. She had come home for the funeral. My sister and my mother were chattering with each other, catching up on the news, and they stopped talking when I came. My sister didn't say anything to me about Jamie, and I didn't say anything to her about him either. Maybe she was afraid I would cry. I sat down on the table and put my hands in my lap, and it was required at our house that you come to meals even if you weren't eating. I hadn't eaten anything since Jamie died. That popsicle was my last. It was over 24 hours now, and my stomach was gnawing on itself, and I had to force my hands to stay in my lap. My stomach was trying to command my hands to grab some food. "Sweetie, it won't help Jamie if you make yourself sick," my mother said. How could I explain to her? Maybe it didn't make much sense, but I knew I couldn't eat until after the funeral. Everyone was talking, eating, moving, just like things were the same. And somehow I could not let things be the same.